Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. I probably know a lot of you, but I can't tell who's on the call right now. My name is Zach Shulman. I run the Entrepreneurship program at Cornell. I'm happily quarantined in my house in Ithaca, where just this week it turned into spring. We had snow, I think, 7 days ago. Today it's almost 70 degrees, so we're all very happy. About to go outside and do our social distancing. So welcome to our fireside chat and beer tasting with the 2020 Cornell Entrepreneur of the Year, Steve Hindy. We both hope you are safe and healthy wherever you might be. Just a couple of logistical things to keep in mind, and then we'll jump right in. Participants will be on mute throughout the event. You will see both Steve and I on video, and occasionally you'll see Amanda from Cornell Entrepreneur Network, who is a partner to Entrepreneurship at Cornell. Amanda is monitoring the chat box for questions. There she is. So if you have questions, please put them into the chat box, and Amanda will ask appropriate questions throughout the fireside chat, actually. So we're not going to wait until the end. We'll do it throughout. The event is being recorded, so we can post it up for later viewing. And importantly, there's two things that you need today. One is probably a bottle opener, if you got one handy. And two is some beer from Brooklyn Brewery. I hope you have that handy as well. Luckily at Wegmans here in Ithaca, they had a whole bunch of it. I know some people were having a hard time getting it, but hopefully you have by now. So we are going to kick things off. Steve, I hear you're in Brooklyn, Maine today, which is kind of ironic, seeing how you're the founder of Brooklyn Brewery. Is that intentional that you're in Brooklyn, Maine?
Brooklyn's been good to me.
That's good. So let's actually start out and take a few minutes just to recount to our audience. By the way, we're up to 200 and almost 240 participants. That's great. How you found yourself at Cornell and also what you studied. I know you a little bit from talking to you in the past, and your history is just so fascinating that I wanted to get it out onto the table before we jump into the Brooklyn Brewery.
Well, in high school, I got very much into golf, and I played on my high school golf team, and actually dreamed of designing golf courses. And the most famous golf course designer, Robert Trent Jones, is a Cornell grad. So I was accepted at Florida State and some southern schools where golf is a big thing. But I chose to come to Cornell because of my interest in designing golf courses. Freshman year, I did a lot more than study and ended up with a 1.9 grade point average. And as you know, that you're not going to last at Cornell if you're under 2.0. My golf handicap was 2, which is very good, but 1.9 is not going to cut it. So I ended up giving up golf entirely. I quit playing during my sophomore year and eventually doubled my GPA up to, above 3.5. And I ended up majoring in English, which wasn't part of the plan, although I had always loved reading and writing. And I just kind of found my way into that at Cornell. There are so many ways you can go at Cornell, as you know, and there's a great English department, and that's where I ended up.
And then after your great English degree, by the way, I still remember my freshman seminar when I was a freshman, obviously, and my professor's name was Diane something, and lo and behold, she ended up living in Ithaca like for a long time, and I kept running into her at the farmer's market. And I'd always say hi and try to remind her who I was. It was just kind of funny. So you graduated with this degree in English, and then what did you do? How did you find yourself in journalism?
Well, I tried teaching high school, actually in Ithaca, and I almost had a nervous breakdown. It's the hardest thing I ever did in my life. I couldn't wait to get out of the classroom. And I ended up going to work for a small newspaper in Geneva, New York, in upstate New York. And I loved it. Being a reporter was very fulfilling to me. I really enjoyed meeting people, writing about them, finding out things. And eventually I got a job with Associated Press in New York City. And a lot of things were happening in my life at that time, and I got up my head, I wanted to see a war. I had always been interested in international affairs, and so I started studying Arabic and said I wanted to go to Beirut. There was a civil war going on in Beirut then. And I learned there aren't too many people who want to go off and cover wars. So a year after volunteering.
I'm sorry, and this was the middle 70s?
This would have been 1977, 78.
Okay.
Yeah. There aren't too many people who want to go to Beirut and cover a war. So a year after volunteering for that job, I landed in Beirut as the Middle East correspondent for AP. And within a couple of months, I was sent to Iran to cover the revolution and the hostage story. I got kicked out of Iran. I went back in with the Iraqi army the next year when they invaded Iran. You know, living in Beirut was crazy with the civil war going on. Eventually, we had the Israeli invasion. My ex-wife joined me in Beirut, and we ended up getting remarried there. And we had our first child in Beirut, and having a baby in Beirut was crazy. So we moved to Cairo, and I got to Cairo just in time to be sitting behind President Sadat of Egypt when he was assassinated. And we spent 3 years in Cairo, 6 years altogether in the Middle East, had our second child in Cairo. And then my wife, Ellen, who, my first wife and second wife, declared she'd had enough of this and was going back to New York with the kids. And so I had the choice between continuing my career. AP wanted me to go to the Philippines next because President Marcos was in trouble. But I chose my family over my career and came back to New York and went to work for Newsday on Long Island as an editor there of foreign news.
Okay.
When I was in the Middle East, I met Americans who worked in Saudi Arabia, where there's Islamic law, no alcohol. And these guys were avid homebrewers. And it was the first time I ever learned you can make beer in your kitchen. And I love beer. I've always been fascinated by beer. And they made really interesting beers, not just, you know, Bud, Coors, and Miller kind of beer, but beer with flavor, beer with color, interesting styles. So when I came back to New York, I started making beer at home and eventually dreaming of starting a brewery in Brooklyn.
And then you actually did it.
I did it, yeah. My downstairs neighbor, Tom Potter, was a banker. He's a Yalie. He had an MBA from Columbia. He had always wanted to start his own business. So eventually I persuaded him we should start a brewery in Brooklyn, which he thought was a crazy idea when he first heard it. It was a crazy idea. You know, Brooklyn has an incredible history of brewing. The last two big breweries in Brooklyn, Schaefer and Rheingold, closed in 1976. So there were no breweries in Brooklyn. And I thought the idea of bringing brewing back to Brooklyn was a good reason for starting a brewery there. You know, when I was at Cornell in late 60s or early 70s, Schaefer and Rheingold were the beers that we drank at the chapter house and in our dorms. Those were big brands back then, but they
they were really tasty, right?
well, not really.
Yeah.
but they were all we had back then. So the idea of bringing back that tradition to New York City, I thought was, a sort of wonderful dream. And that was the beginnings of Brooklyn Brewery.
Excellent. So,
Our first beer we're going to taste, right?
yeah, actually, I think we should do that now. I'm getting kind of into it. So, are we going with a lager?
Brooklyn Lager, yeah.
Okay.
So
For the folks online, if you have a lager, by all means. Oh, Steve's already got his open. Look at that. I'm going to probably do it the wrong way and just go right out of the bottle. But it'd be great if you could give us a little history about this variety. I'm guessing it was the first one.
It was our first beer.
Yeah.
It's based on the lager beers that were brewed in Brooklyn back in the heyday of the Brooklyn breweries. When Brooklyn became part of New York City in 1898, there were 48 breweries in Brooklyn, most of them lager breweries, many of them very small, but some bigger brands like Schaefer and Rheingold that kind of broke out. And this lager beer is the same kind of beer made by Budweiser, Coors, and Miller, but obviously this lager beer has a lot of points of difference between the big mass breweries in the US. So it's made with darker malts, so you get a darker color. The malts have been roasted a bit. It's got a big aroma, a big hop aroma, which we like. And when it was, today it's considered a kind of entry-level craft beer. But when I started 32 years ago, Brooklyn Lager was a shock to a lot of beer drinkers because it was dark, because it was bitter, because it had a big aroma. And a lot of people didn't like it. But thank God enough people did that we were able to get a foothold and sell some beer.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So I was going to promise myself that I wasn't going to look at the chat box during the webinar just now, but I actually am. So it's actually really nice to see some of you on there that I actually know from when I was in college. So while we're focused on this, so the logo, which I'm holding up in front of the screen now for those that don't have a bottle in front of them, where did the logo come from? It looks like a baseball logo to me. For a baseball team.
One of my tasks when we started was to develop the identity of the company and the name and why Brooklyn. So I wanted to call it Brooklyn Eagle Beer after the old Brooklyn Eagle newspaper, which is a historic newspaper in Brooklyn, once edited by Walt Whitman. And I ended up on a quest. I ended up interviewing like 30 design firms, trying to find a designer who would actually tell me something. Because most of the designers I talked to wanted to sell me. So they were flattering me and talking about how great the idea was, Brooklyn Eagle Beer, what a genius I was. And I knew I was clueless about, starting a brewery. I wanted someone to help me. So actually my wife, Ellen, saw me get really frustrated in this quest. And she said, why don't you call the best designers in New York? So we called a friend and she referred me to Chermayeff and Geismar and Pentagram and Milton Glaser and a few others. And we got meetings with these hotshot design firms. I mean, it's some of the best designers in the world. The only designer I knew anything about was Milton Glaser, because when I was at Cornell, I noticed that Milton designed all the Hermann Hesse novels, which were very popular back then. He also designed the covers of the Penguin Shakespeare series, and he did the Bob Dylan album back in the 60s with Dylan with psychedelic hair. So I knew Milton, that was the only designer I knew about. But when I called his office, this woman named Eva answered the phone. And I told her who I was. And she said, do you know who Milton is? And I said, well, yeah, I hear he's pretty good. I want to talk to him. And she said, he doesn't just talk to anyone who calls here. And it kind of brought out the journalist in me. I started bugging her every day. I'd call her and tell her what was going on in the world, call her from the newspaper. And eventually she said, "You're not going to give up, are you?" And I said, "No, I want to talk to Milton Glaser." She said, "Okay, here he is." Put Milton on. Milton said, "This is a cool idea. Come and see me." So we ended up making a deal with Milton Glaser. And our first meeting about the design, Milton said, you got Brooklyn here. Nobody is claiming Brooklyn. There are no companies named after Brooklyn. So Brooklyn, it's a powerful image. It's a powerful word and name. Forget the bird. You don't need the eagle. Let's just call it Brooklyn. Brooklyn Lager, Brooklyn Brewery. And it was like, yes, that's what I was looking for, some guidance. And then when he unveiled the logo with the bee, it was very dramatic. He had a bottle made up and he unveiled the logo. And I said, "That's it?" And he said, "Look, don't say a word. Take it home, put it on your kitchen table, show it to your wife. Don't show it to a lot of people. Just live with it a little." And I did, and it kind of sunk in the simple beauty of that bee, the way it kind of evokes sports, but it's not just a smarmy, nostalgia about the Brooklyn Dodgers. It's a brilliant logo, and it's enabled us to sell beer not only in New York, but all over the world. Wow. And the name Brooklyn, now there are hundreds of companies named after Brooklyn and consumer products of all kinds.
Yeah, if it makes you feel any better or worse, that's actually happening in Ithaca as well. We have Ithaca hummus and all these other types of things. There are a couple of questions I got to ask because they're relevant. First of all, do you think beer tastes better coming out of a can or a bottle?
I think, I would always favor a bottle, I think, an ice cold bottle of beer. But actually the can preserves the beer better than the bottle
because of the light.
It doesn't allow any light in, and light is the enemy of beer.
Gotcha.
Because light creates a kind of chemical reaction with the hop particles in the beer.
Yeah. How about this one? It says, this is from someone named Doug Miller, and maybe you know Doug, because it's, by the way the question is worded, I can kind of tell you know him. It says, Please tell the story about when you started in Brooklyn and the mob.
Well, that was, I'll try to keep this story short. When we were building our brewery in 1995, we were, the whole process was blocked by these union business agents who came in and shut us down. And it turned out they were pretty shady characters, but they shut us down for like 10 or 12 days. And eventually I had a sort of climactic meeting with the boss of the group and two other of his sidekicks, each of whom had two bodyguards with them, like young guys who couldn't button their top button. And I ended up sweating in a broken office chair in our warehouse. And the boss came on to me. I couldn't get out of the office chair because I was leaning back in it. He put his hand between my legs and squeezed and said, "We're going to have to hurt you." I was flabbergasted. Then he grabbed me by the shoulders and jammed me into the wall and said, "Just kidding. We'd like you to come to our Christmas party. Bring your wife. Take an ad in our journal. We're going to leave you alone." And then they left. And eventually the workers came back and we finished the project. I wrote about this in my first book, Beer School. I didn't name any names. When the book came out, New York Magazine interviewed me, and they wanted to know the name of the boss. And I said, you got to be kidding me. I'll leave it.
Right, right.
But I Googled the guy. He went to jail for extortion and racketeering the year before the book came out, for putting no-show jobs on a school construction project 31 blocks from my house in Brooklyn. So I had always wondered if they were really bad guys or if they were just playing around with me. They were really bad guys.
Right, right.
I was very fortunate.
Well, I'm glad you made out okay. Go ahead, Amanda.
So I'm just seeing some of the questions coming in through the chat, and to go back to the beer in a bottle versus can. Somebody wants to know, do you find the taste in a can is different than a bottle? Is pouring from a can into a glass have the same taste as straight out of a bottle? And somebody jumped in and said they prefer a sturdy frosted glass mug, but maybe you could talk about that a little bit more.
Well, there shouldn't be any difference in the taste between the two vessels, but I think there is, because so many things affect the taste of a beer. I think it's really a matter of personal preference, which vessel you prefer. Both of them, I like to pour the beer right down the middle of the glass to give a chance for some foam to develop. I think foam it releases a lot of the nice aromas of the beer. And, you don't want to overdo it with that, but you want some head on your beer.
Hey, I'm sorry, Steve,
So
how long did it take Milton to design the logo, by the way?
That question came in our chat too.
Yeah.
I've become, Milton's one of my closest friends. I had a long talk with him today. He's not in good shape. He'll be 91 in July. But I've learned over the years, Milton works very quickly. I can imagine he had this done in a day. I do have the original drawings, sketches he did. He started out thinking of like classic European beer labels, like Pilsner Urquell, which often have script, names. And then the B, he says, he kind of imagined thinking about the foam, about the head on a glass of beer. And that B has a kind of cloud-like organic feel to it. But I know Milton works very quickly. I mean, I've been with him when people have called him and asked him for things, and in a matter of minutes, he's sketched it. That's the difference between a genius and someone who'd like to be a genius.
Another question we had, there's a couple more, and then we could maybe do the next beer. But Helena Wu wants to know, we got to go to the next one. What types of beers are trending now? Hazy IPA, sours, hard seltzers. I feel like I see a lot of commercials for the seltzers lately, but what are you seeing, Steve?
Yeah, hazy IPAs are very popular, and we don't have a hazy IPA yet, but we're developing one, which I hope will come out later this year. We have done some we have done some triple IPAs in cans, but limited volume. Those are very popular. Sours are very popular. We're going to try our Bel Air Sour later, and the hard seltzer, I do not consider that beer. I think that is the enemy of beer. The idea that you're drinking alcohol with seltzer water, to me, is antithetical to the beautiful taste and traditions of beer. So I am anti-hard seltzer.
No uncertain terms. Well, listen, let's open the next bottle of Pilsner, right? Is that the next one on our list?
Yes.
Okay. let's do the Pilsner. And then I have a question, actually, that will kind of get us into a next section of discussion. So while we're pouring and opening, somebody wrote on the chat, this is from Dave Byers, actually, who I think I know. He wrote, with the disruption of operations and buying patterns due to COVID, what do you see the future of the craft beer industry looking like? And this is one of the things that we had talked about during our prep also. So I think it'd be relevant to cover. But we also need to cover Pilsner. So I'll leave it to you to decide which order.
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about Brooklyn Pilsner. So Budweiser, Coors, Miller, they're all lager beers. They're all Pilsner beers. And Pilsner is a style that was developed in Czechoslovakia back in the day. And it's made with very light grains, and then hops. This has hops from Czech Republic and from Germany. This is much more flavorful than Bud, Coors, or Miller, all of which have either rice or corn additives to them. This is 100% malted barley and a much richer flavor, and the hop character is much more pronounced in this Pilsner than in the mainstream Pilsners. It's a popular beer for us. We've had it for many, many years, and tasting good today.
Well, let's down the hatch. We have a bunch of different cheers coming through the chat as well. So
good. So the
I'll
question.
jump in here with a couple. Oh, sorry.
we
Go
have
ahead,
to get
Steve.
back to the other question. We had a question a minute that he didn't answer yet.
Yeah.
Apologies.
Come on now. Okay, go ahead.
The plague that we're enduring has had a very negative impact on craft brewers. 45% of our sales are to bars and restaurants. So that part of our business disappeared, starting in early March. And that's been very difficult for us. We laid off, we have about 160 employees. We laid off about 50 people when that happened. We brought them all back when we got the PPP money from the federal government, but I'm not sure what the future is going to be. Our sales through stores, through chain stores and delis, et cetera, is through the roof, but not enough to make up for the loss of the restaurants and bars. When I started Brooklyn Brewery, there were fewer than 50 brewing companies in America. And today there are more than 8,000 brewing companies in America. I think several thousand of those are at great risk of what's happened. And that is because most of the startup breweries from the last 5 years make most of their money from selling beer at their location, at what is called a tasting room. And that's been shut down at so many places. And they'll face the same kind of peril that the restaurant industry faces when you reopen. If you can only reopen with a third of your space, that's probably not going to be economically viable. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens. Brooklyn Brewery also is the biggest exporter of American craft beer. So 50% of our sales is exported around the world. And that has gone down less than our domestic sales problem. So, we will survive this. We're in good shape, but things are going to change for the future. And we're predicting that this year we will probably lose about 30 to 40% of our business for the whole year.
Wow. And are you concerned about company culture? How do you maintain company culture in the face of a pandemic when you might face more layoffs and all the uncertainty surrounding it?
Well, we're in touch with our brewing team, our marketing team. We are doing Zoom meetings virtually every day. The brewery is operating under the government, New York State government. Breweries were considered essential businesses. So we've been able to operate throughout this. But the problem is our customers are out of business.
Yeah, it's terrible. Absolutely terrible. There was a really interesting question that came in on the Zoom, or on the chat, that I also want to cover. It was in some of our discussion previously. So a lot of people know that you sold a good chunk of the brewery to Kirin, the big Japanese beverage company. Do you still feel independent? How involved is Kirin in the business? What drove you to make that decision to sell?
You know, we started exporting from the early days of Brooklyn Brewery, and the first export we did was to Japan through a total amateur, a guy who was an oil company executive from Japan who was fascinated by Brooklyn Brewery. And so we started selling in Japan. And we sold there for many years, but the Japanese are very loyal to their three big brewing companies, Asahi, Suntory, and Kirin. As our export business grew in Europe and around the world, it didn't really go very far in Japan. So when we were approached by Kirin about investing in Brooklyn Brewery, we realized that they were totally committed to developing the Brooklyn brand in Japan, and they wanted our help in doing that. So it was a way for us to get into the Japanese market. We sold 24% of the company. So we have a person from Kirin on our 7-member board. But their interest is mainly in the Japanese market and the Australian market. They're the biggest brewer in Australia. So they're doing great numbers with us now in Japan, and they're totally committed to craft beer, much more so. They got a big head start on their competitors. Also, I was amazed to learn that the CEO of Kirin is a Cornell grad. And yeah, that was kind of a thrill. So Yoshi and I actually taught a class at the business school with Doug Miller a couple of years ago, and that was a thrill for both of us. I think since then, Kirin funded a number of scholarships for Japanese students to come to Cornell.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
How about this one? What are your top 3 favorite beer countries?
Well, I mean, you'd have to say Belgium, and you'd have to say the UK, and I think you'd have to say America. I mean, no country in the world has the innovation and the excitement that has been generated by the craft beer revolution in the US. You know, I think 30 years ago, America was a laughingstock as a brewing country around the world because not too many Europeans or anywhere in the world were so impressed by light lager beer made by Bud, Coors, and Miller. But today, America is the wellspring of this craft revolution, and it's happening all over the world now. And I'm happy to say Brooklyn Brewery and Brooklyn Lager in particular have been a big driver of that international phenomenon.
Yeah, it's great, and you're seeing very much involved in that as well. I mean, now that you're not actually running the business any longer, right? In terms of day to day.
That's right. Yeah, I'm chairman of the board, and you know, I do a lot of talking.
Yep. Do you consider Cornell to be intertwined at all in the beer industry? And we have some famous Cornellians besides you that are that are involved in brewing, right? It'd be nice to get your thoughts on that.
What's the question, Zach?
Oh, I asked whether you consider Cornell to be entwined in the beer industry, right? Because we have a bunch of alums that are quite prominent executives at a bunch of beer companies.
Yeah, when I was at Cornell, I met Peter Coors at I think a smoker at SciU. And
A smoker, by the way, a thing that doesn't exist anymore.
Right. He was a very impressive guy. He's about 6'5", and he looks like he belongs in the Rocky Mountains. I've since gotten to know him. I served on a board with him of a trade association, yeah, we've talked about our Cornell roots. Actually, the Coors family, I think, going back before Peter, they're all engineers. And I think there are many people in that family are Cornellians, including Peter's wife. I think there are a number of small brewers too around the country with Cornell education. I heard that one of the guys at what's the brewery in Cincinnati? There's one in Cincinnati that's doing really well. I'm spacing on the name, but I heard he's a Cornell grad. I've thought about reaching out to him.
You should.
You should. And I think there's some in New York City with Cornell background too.
Okay. I think that guy's name is Ringheist, perhaps.
Rheingeist, that's right. Yeah. Certainly, we drank a lot of beer when my years at Cornell.
So why would a company like Guinness from the UK open a craft brewery in America? I guess they did in Brooklyn. I'm sorry, in Baltimore.
Because all of the big brewers want to get in on the craft revolution, because the only part of the beer industry that is growing and has grown over the last 20 years is craft beer. So the big brewers have invested heavily in developing their craft brands, and they're big competitors for independent craft breweries like Brooklyn.
Good.
By the way, I just published a book. I've published a couple of books in English, Beer School and the Craft Beer Revolution. This is The Beer Makes Brooklyn Hip. And this was published in Japan on April 30th.
That's great.
And it's really cool, I think. I can't.
You mean you haven't read it yet?
I wrote it in English, translated it, and I actually took their lead on how to package it, and I think it's a pretty cool book, and I may be doing an English version of it. And it really talks about how we've developed this international business, which is amazing, because we've never really spent a lot of money on marketing around the world. It's been word of mouth marketing.
That's fabulous. Amanda.
Yeah, so let me jump in here with a couple other questions that came in through the chat and in advance. We actually have Matthew Perna in the chat asked about, he said, being in Colorado, I don't have a Brooklyn beer to join you, but I have one of our craft brews. Do you think the fresh Rocky Mountain water contributes to unique beers? And we received one in advance of today also asking about New York City water. It's the reason the bagels and the pizza taste so good. How does that impact Brooklyn Brewery's beer?
I am not a believer in the magic of water. And I'll tell you why. Because water chemistry is a very sophisticated technology, and all brewers tinker with their water to make it consistent. So, and the whole idea of Rocky Mountain water or New York City water really is marketing talk. You know, back in the day, I think when breweries really did get their water from wells and they were dependent on the purity of that water, I think water was important. I think today, if any brewer is honest with you, they will admit that they tinker with the water to make it consistent.
Okay, it's good. It's good to know.
Great. Brian Webb says, thanks for asking and answering. I've noticed a lot of the breweries in Maryland are releasing a lot of specialty beers from their limited release series. Is this something that Brooklyn Brewery is doing in the near future to increase direct sales?
Well, the pandemic has created a very interesting situation. So we sell our beer through distributors, and they're typically the big distributor. We started out distributing our own beer because the big distributors had no interest in us. And actually, that was one of the reasons we were able to succeed, I think, through self-distribution. But we sold it to the big distributors. Big distributors now are cutting back on the number of styles that they will sell from each brewery. So a lot of our specialty beers are at risk of not reaching the market. So we are considering and probably will go back to distributing some of our specialty beers ourselves. And that's called direct-to-consumer sales. You can do that in New York State. In most states, you cannot do that. But many state governments have relaxed the rules to enable that to happen, because a lot of these tasting room breweries will die if they cannot sell direct to consumer. So that's going to be a big issue going forward. You know, I can't imagine, the craft revolution is about diversity and variety and the rainbow of beer styles. And I don't like the idea of distributors telling me we're only going to carry Brooklyn Lager and Brooklyn Defender Ale and maybe the Brooklyn Sour or Summer Ale or whatever. I want to be able to sell our specialty beers, our triple IPAs and our Belgian style beers that come in the big bottle. And, I don't think the distributor should be making a decision about what beers the beer drinkers have available.
Amanda, on that note, we might want to try the next beer. Can we open the next one? Because
I think
we have about 15 minutes
I think
left.
get the next beer up. Yep. And I think while you guys do that, I'm just gonna.
No. Oh yeah. No.
Which one did you want?
Defender.
Defender?
Yeah.
I got one of those.
So while you guys are pouring, let me just follow up on that last comment, because we've seen a couple questions come in about e-commerce and online sales impacting the beer industry, and just your thoughts on that, Steve. And I'll let you guys taste.
So
this is my favorite so far, by the way.
Oh, you like the IPA, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah. Let me tell you a little bit about this beer. So we first developed this beer for the Comic-Con. You know the Comic-Con,
Yeah.
the comic book convention that's held in New York City. They're held around the country, but big one in New York City. So we made a beer called Brooklyn Defender for them. And we did it every year as a special beer. And we had a different artist, comic book artist, do the label every year with a different superhero on the label. And it became very popular. And so we made it eventually a year-round beer for us. And then in a lot of countries where we sell, they would not allow us to use the comic book character on the label because of the fear that it would appeal to children. So we simplified it down to Brooklyn Defender IPA. But this is kind of a West Coast IPA. Our second best-selling beer is Brooklyn East IPA, which actually has been around since 1994, and that was one of the first IPAs done by any craft brewery. And that beer is a very balanced IPA. This beer has a lot more hop character. It's more like a West Coast style IPA. And as I said, we'll be coming out with that hazy IPA later this year. And I think our sales team is talking about developing a variety pack with 4 different IPAs later this year.
We'll definitely buy that.
Now,
Hey,
I'm sorry, Amanda, what was that question?
I forgot the question too, and it's not because I've been drinking beer. I forgot the question.
We're 3 beers in at this point. Zach, you're going to have to sign off.
Yeah.
The question was related to e-commerce and online sales for the beer industry, and your thoughts on that.
Well, I think most brewers would be all for it. Distributors are going to resist it because they like to totally control the route to market. And I think there's some fear that Amazon could swallow a huge part of the beer business if that e-commerce happens. But I'm not afraid of that. I think you know, people should be allowed to buy beer, you know, any way possible. I'm very much against limiting beer sales to you know, traditional distributors and retailers.
Okay, I got a couple other questions that I'm going to take from the chat. Actually, a couple of them are very short ones. What do you do with your spent grains?
So at the brewery in Brooklyn and our brewery, you know, we brew at the Matt Brewery, the Saranac Brewery in Utica. We're partners in that brewery. And both breweries, at night, huge trucks come in, dump trucks, and pick up the spent grain. And it is sold to farmers in upstate New York and in New Jersey. I've heard it said that when the brewery truck comes into the barnyard, the pigs like charge the fences, you know, it's like happy hour down on the farm.
That's great. And has Brooklyn Brewery ever considered sponsoring the New York Mets?
No.
Is that because the Mets are terrible, or is that because it's financial issues?
No, I love the Mets. I would love to be able to sponsor the Mets. And actually, they do sell a lot of our beer, I'm happy to say. But we pretty much committed to not do traditional advertising many years ago. And you know, we did a lot of promotions, like seat of the pants promotions. You know, early on, I did something called the Brooklyn Lager Band Search for a competition for unsigned bands in jazz, world beat, and rock. And actually, we ended up getting played on NPR with that. Not just, you know, actually, they replayed our concerts. So we've done a lot of seat of the pants kind of marketing. We did something called the Brooklyn Mash, which was like a week-long festival we did in 12 cities in the US and in Europe, celebrating the local Brooklyn culture in those cities. And you know, this whole Brooklyn thing of bringing back, you know, old industrial neighborhoods and that sort of thing is happening all over the world. And it's recognized as a Brooklyn thing. So, you know, this was not like New York coming to Paris and saying, we're New York, we're great. It was more like, let's celebrate the people in Paris who are doing cool things in their community. And the same thing in New Orleans or Chicago and around the country. These are all, we made these things up, and it kind of built the word of mouth marketing of Brooklyn Brewery. And, you know, somehow that's enabled us to become a significant brand in Europe and Asia and all around the world.
That's awesome.
So
Okay, are you ready for?
I would love to sponsor the Mets, but you know what that costs? I mean,
I can imagine.
Anheuser-Busch, I mean, you're talking like, you know, $20 million a year for that billboard in center field.
Yeah, that's insane.
Forget that.
Okay, are you ready for an esoteric question? Have you had enough to drink yet?
Yeah, I'm getting there.
So the question is, do creative inspirations still occupy your daily thoughts?
Creative inspirations?
Yeah.
Well, I'm actually struggling to write another book, which the working title is My Drinking Life. You know, so far I'm still in high school, and you know, writing is hard. I don't care who you are. Writing is very hard, and I'm struggling with that. So yeah, if the questioner has any ideas for inspiration, please email me.
Okay. Hey, is Brooklyn beer available in Brooklyn, Maine?
Yes. Yeah. I bought these beers here in.
Very important to know. And have you ever considered doing a variety for Cornell? I mean, there's all sorts of things you could call it. I mean, it actually would fit, right? I mean, red ale, whatever. I mean,
no. You know, so many organizations and people.
Hey, Steve, it's Cornell. Come on, it's Cornell.
Yeah. So, well, okay. Yeah, I love Cornell. But, you know, people come to us all the time, like Tony Bennett came to us and wanted to do a beer for his 90th birthday. And, you know, he's a great guy, by the way. I mean, I got pictures with Tony Bennett. He looks like a 60-year-old, amazing man. But, you know, marketing a beer like that, just because it says Tony Bennett on the label or Cornell on the label, doesn't mean you're going to be able to become part of the market. You know, I mean, it's.
Well, maybe you could just do like a limited seasonal thing for a reunion or something. You know, I mean, granted, the customer base might be kind of small. I understand that. Although Cornell is probably the largest alumni base in New York City. I'd have to guess.
I would advise you to talk to, I'm forgetting his name now, but the guy at Ithaca Beer Company, who's a
Dan Mitchell. Yeah.
Yeah, Dan.
Yeah.
I think that's a great idea for Dan. I'm going to pass that idea to him.
Good. Amanda.
So let me jump in here because I'm watching the clock and we advertised a happy hour. I think we have one more beer left.
Right.
And while you guys pull that up, remind me which one it is. What are we doing next?
Brooklyn Bel Air Sour.
There we go. And then, Steve, I'll let you pull this one up and talk about it for a minute, and then I can jump in with a couple more questions here in the chat, which hopefully we could talk about some advice for up-and-coming craft brewers, because I've seen a couple questions about that. So go ahead, Steve. Tell us about the Bel Air Sour.
So this is a sour style beer, and it's made by a second fermentation with a lactobacillus, like the same bacteria that you use to produce yogurt. So this happens early in the process, and then it gets fermented along with the regular fermentation. And I think it's a pretty wonderful beer. I like this. I think it's a great thirst quencher. It's great after playing golf or tennis or any kind of sport. We also have a really cool spin-off of this, which was a spring seasonal you may see in the market, called Rose de Ville. And it's this same beer, with a raspberry flavoring. It's actually raspberries into the brew, and it's really, really nice flavor, the sweetness of the raspberries with the tartness of the Bel Air Sour. We'll have a beer later this year, I think, called Key Lime Sour, which will have a key lime flavor blended into the beer.
That's great. Now, Amanda, what was that question you had?
So we had a couple of folks asking for advice about being craft brewers themselves. Any advice for just starting up, and then again, the next 3 to 5 years? It seems like we might have a few people that are in the early stages of this, and any advice or lessons that you learned along your journey would be great.
Well, the situation today is very different, obviously, than it was 32 years ago. I feel that I was in the pioneering generation of craft brewers, and really, our job was to educate Americans about beer and about the incredible history of beer and the incredible number of styles of beer. And it's funny because I think I failed as an English teacher, but it turned out I was a pretty good beer teacher. So, but today, everyone knows what craft beer is. I mean, people, Amanda, in your generation grew up with craft beer. You probably can't imagine, kicking back with a Coors Light or whatever. I hope you can't imagine that.
In my early days, it was Coors Light, but thank you for thinking that.
But so today, I mean, out of those 8,000 breweries, let's say 4,000 of them started in the last 10 years, within the last 10 years. And most of them had found success opening a small, local, hyper-local brewery and making most of their income from selling at their location. So obviously that's going to be a challenge this year with the plague that we're dealing with. But I think ultimately that is a model that is much more likely to succeed today than, starting out with a big brewing operation like we eventually did. I think it's going to be very difficult to break into, even regional distribution beyond your local market because the distributors just aren't taking on new brands now, and they're limiting the number of beers that we can sell through them. I think I want to say one thing about, a lot of people say to me, isn't it about local? And why are you selling in Paris? Why are you selling in London, Stockholm? I feel that when you create a beer brand, it's almost like a being. It becomes part of the world. It becomes part of the culture. And you follow that brand where it takes you. We didn't set out to sell beer in Japan or Stockholm or Paris. We were hoping to sell beer in Brooklyn and New York City. But our brand took us to all these places. And I think it's still possible that someone could create a brand that would have the same kind of legs that Brooklyn has had. But I think it's much more difficult now for that to happen because the craft beer revolution now is happening all over the world, and you're competing against Swedish brewers or French brewers or Japanese brewers. So I think if you're starting out now, the best model is to be hyper-local and build a very loyal local market.
Good advice.
Great. So David Heath has hit us on every channel here. He has a question he desperately wants to ask, and I'm curious now too. Are you currently home brewing? And if so, what batch are you making?
No, I'm very happy to say I am not home brewing. We are brewing every day at the brewery in Brooklyn and the brewery in Utica, and now at a brewery in Stockholm and a brewery in Tokyo, and that's enough for me. I'm very happy tasting all the beers that we're making these days.
Yeah, I can say I'm actually happy that you're not home brewing. It would be almost troubling if you were.
Yeah, no, I mean, our brewers are coming up with amazing beers, and it's all I can do to keep up with testing them all. You know how everyone wants to be the beer tester? Well, I'm
Yeah.
a beer tester. Actually, one more beer I just want to mention, Brooklyn Special Effects. This is a no alcohol beer, which we released a few months ago, and it's really selling well. We released it in Europe last January, and it's become a significant brand there. And I think it's going to be big in the US too. It's actually a no alcohol beer that tastes good, which I think is unusual if you've ever tried the mainstream no alcohol beers. So the special effects. The special effect is you don't get inebriated.
This could be a good thing or a bad thing. Okay, I think, do we have to close off, Amanda? I think we're a little past 5.
We're a little past 5, so yeah, I'm seeing a lot of people thanking you today, Steve, for your time, and they really enjoyed this, and folks from all over the world have tuned in. So just a reminder to everybody that we are recording this, and we'll share the link with everybody afterwards. So you can, if you couldn't get Brooklyn beer today, you can rewatch this when you can get it. But thanks, Steve, again for your time. And yeah, Zach, we can wrap it up.
Okay, great. So we should all raise our glasses to Steve. And of course, Amanda. Absolutely. So thank you so much for joining us in. We actually topped out just at 300 people, which is awesome. And we will be continuing this fireside chat series just about monthly with other, what I would call high-level executives like Steve. So look forward, or be on the lookout for emails from Cornell Entrepreneur Network and from Entrepreneurship at Cornell. You'll get those in the near future. Steve, thanks so much. Enjoy Brooklyn, Maine.
Thank you, Amanda. It's an honor
Thank
to
you,
be
Steve.
Entrepreneur of the Year at Cornell. Particularly, you remember, I almost flunked out freshman year.
No, it's actually not an unusual trend among our entrepreneurs of the year.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
Cheers.
There's a bunch of risk taking there. Okay. Cheers, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.